All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Kate Herron. I'm from the Office of Proposal Development, so thank you all so much for being here, especially because I know it's wet and cold out there, so especially thank you. We have coffee and muffins and a sign-in sheet if you guys haven't signed in already. So the data management workshop, so this is becoming especially important now. We're finding that agencies are asking for data management plans, but also more robust plan. So Renee is going to do an awesome workshop on this. We are recording it, so these mics are not for amplifying our sound, it's for recording. So if you have any questions, Renee is going to repeat the question so that it can be captured on the camera. So just to let you know if Renee is repeating your question. And that's all I have, so I'm going to turn it over to him, and thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. Like Kate said, thank you so much for coming today. Fortunately, I dried off just in time to give this presentation. And today we're going to talk about creating a data management plan. So a lot of times I get invited to classrooms to talk about why do we manage research data, why it's the right thing to do. Today we're going to focus more on meeting funder requirements and actually how to draft the DMP and what needs to go into it. That being said, do not feel obligated to save your questions till the end. If I forget to repeat your question, remind me because I'm supposed to for the recording. But as you have questions, just raise your hand, and if I am not paying attention, just blurt something out because I don't see you. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by defining research data, because you have to in a data management workshop. And we're going to talk about data types and formats. Most of this will kind of be reviewed from research methods classes you've either taken and or taught, but you'll need to be able to recall that type of information very quickly. So we'll do a brief overview. We'll define data management, and we'll spend a lot of time discussing emerging funder policies. Particularly, we'll spend a lot of time with the NIH and the NSF, and we have some information from NOAA as well as some humanities agencies as well. And then we're going to spend time actually looking at data management plans, and you'll have some time to kind of poke through some resources we have, because I'm going to show you a tool called DMP Tool, which is created to help you actually write data management plans by funder agencies. Any questions before we get started? Fantastic. So when I first started doing this job, I didn't even introduce myself. I'm Renee. I'm the data research librarian here at FSU. I've been here since April 2014. I'm a recent graduate. And when I started, I thought I was going to do lots of things here related to finding data, buying data, helping people evaluate information sources. But the biggest need are these federal funding requirements. So that's what we've spent the most time doing since I've started here. And the first thing I did, the very first time I ever was asked to talk about data management in a classroom setting, I went and did research and I tried to find the best definition of data I could find. And I quickly realized that you're never going to get two researchers from two different disciplines to agree on what research data is. So rather than do that, I chose an academic definition. And this is my favorite. It comes from Christine Borgman, who is she's the chair of the Information Studies program at UCLA. And I like hers because she doesn't look at what data is, but rather what it does. So data is an output of research and input to future publications and further learning. Whenever I talk about this stuff in a classroom setting, I try to get students to understand that data is a product of your research, but it's also a source of future research and future learning. So. But a more binding definition, and one that we will work with a little more, is the one that actually comes from the government. And this is in the Code of Federal Regulations. It's actually a recent addition. And they define research data as the recorded factual material necessary to validate research findings. So you'll notice, I highlighted the word, actually I'm supposed to stay behind the podium. I highlighted the word validate because the definition that they use is specifically written to where data are things that are necessary to reproduce research. And luckily, I can move, great. So luckily in the Federal Code of Regulations that we were going through, this was a circular, originally the data definition, but it actually tells you what research data isn't, which is going to be helpful because when we work with researchers here on campus on helping draft data management plans, there's a lot of sometimes apprehension and nervousness that you have to just hand over all of your trade secrets, all your information, and you have to do things that may or may not violate IRB and things like that. So some of the things that aren't research data, your preliminary analysis, your papers, emails, you don't have to share all your emails with colleagues, peer reviews. These things are not considered research data for the purposes of data management. More importantly, trade secrets, commercial information, these things do not have to be written in a data management plan, and you can sort of explain why you're not going to include that information. And most importantly, you'll see when we look into the NIH policies a little more closely, you're exempt from providing medical information, which is pretty obvious, but that's a lot of the apprehension I see from researchers are trying to strike that balance between what the IRB is asking them to do and not doing HIPAA violations, but also satisfying funder public access requirements. So this type of language exists so that you can kind of draw on it and know what you do and have to share and don't have to share. And so this is mostly a review, I hope, of kind of research data types. So how many of you conduct surveys as part of your research? Oh, good, some folks, right? So that's observational data. And the reason we have to kind of go through that is because in your data management plan, they're going to ask, in my research, I will be developing a survey instrument and implementing a survey that will create observational data. As obvious as it may seem, we still have to actually mention that. Same thing with experimental. Anybody from doing meteorology or weather data? So you have your forecast, everyone's building a climate model, everyone's building a new forecasting model. This is simulation data, and it's things that actually have to be stated in the data management plan. And one thing you'll notice with these definitions is that things don't always fit very neatly into boxes. So for example, as part of your survey research, you're gonna have your microdata, which are your observational data points that you may or may not be able to share based on privacy. But you're also gonna have derived and compiled data because you're gonna have summary statistics and analysis that are gonna be included in your paper. And so what I did is I just sort of listed a few different research data formats. When we go through some of the individual policies in more detail, you'll see that they ask you to actually list every piece of data produced, what type of data it is, and then what type of format, right? So if you're gonna give your lab procedures, if you're gonna provide your lab procedures as part of research data for your project, you actually have to put that it's a PDF or it's a text file. Same thing with numerical. If you use Stata, SPSS, Excel, how many of you use Stata for your data analysis? What about R? A few people. What are the tools that you all commonly use? It's my favorite question to ask for research. What's that? SPSS? Okay, cool. So, and another thing that the funder requirements, or the funders ask is, have you ever heard of the concept of proprietary versus non-proprietary data formats? It's something that most people don't give a lot of thought to. But when you create research data and for your project, you want to have a trail that other people can kind of leave breadcrumbs where they can go behind you and actually validate your research. So if you do your statistical analysis in Stata, it saves it in a particular file format that can only be read by Stata. But one alternative would be to save a copy of that flat data file as a CSV, because that's a non-proprietary data format. I can go and download any spreadsheet viewer on the internet, and I can look at your data. I may not be able to do the exact analysis you did because I might not have Stata, but at least have access to the raw information if I wanted to look into it further. So. And there are data formats that are going to be strange. So I listed some ones that I purposely tried to find things that I didn't know anything about. Does anybody actually use any of these here? No? I did a class at Nova Southeastern and somebody actually used this gridded binary thing. But essentially, some specific microscopes or specific tools that you use for your research are going to save things in very specific file formats. And sometimes those things cannot be converted. So you can't convert a satellite image to a JPEG unless you actually have a certain program. And so you have to list all those data types as well as file formats. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at examples of research data, because when we work with folks writing data management plans, what we find is that the first draft of the data management plan only has about a third of the research data listed that comes from the project. The reason being is you use a lot of things and there's a lot of information that you take for granted that you might not consider research data. So we know that spreadsheets with our observations are data. If you're recording interviews, or if you have transcripts, that's data. If you're taking images of Earth, things like that. Those are all research data that you need to include. But another are scripts and codes. So how many of you write your own scripts in order to do data analysis, like in Python or R or something like that? I don't either, but lots of folks do. And so, for example, I've worked with a geographer here on campus he doesn't use ArcGIS. He does everything in QGIS, which is all open source, but it's limited. So when he needs to do a certain type of analysis, he kind of just lifts under the hood and he writes his own Python scripts because that's what QGIS is written in. So in order to validate his research findings, you have to have the code he wrote, or else you don't know what type of statistical analysis he did. So that's something to consider if you're writing code or if a software product is what you're creating. Is there anyone from the computer science department here? So sometimes your research product is an actual software program. But things that aren't obvious are lab notebooks. How many of you consider your lab notebooks research data? Some people do, some people don't. That's a point of contention sometimes because you have that gray line of some lab notebooks are kind of a form of communication sometimes. They can be sort of a diary. But other things that people don't consider are the actual copies of the survey instrument you use. So if you have consent forms, it's good to have a blank copy of the consent form as well as a blank copy of the survey instrument. How many of you know what a code book is? So you all write your own data dictionaries? That's good. A lot of folks don't. So I always tell a story about when I was in grad school. I'm a graduate of the urban planning program. I have a master's in urban and regional planning. And my capstone project was to do a feasibility analysis of what if we just ripped up Tennessee Street and we ripped up Monroe Street and we just replaced it with light rail, because that would be way easier for people to get around. So that was our project. We had a GIS, we had a shape file that had census data in census tracts. We had the actual existing bus route system from Star Metro. They provided that with us. And we also had the light rail lines that we built in Cube Voyager, which is our modeling software that we used. And what we did is we wanted to look at existing patterns in transit ridership. So we got survey data from Star Metro. They had a recent ridership or an onboard survey. So I had origins and destinations of where people were riding the bus in Tallahassee, which was fantastic. So we got the sheet. It was just a CSV file. I opened it up, and it was just not comprehensible. There were missing variables. The variables were literally var1, var2, var 2.1 through 9, and then 3. And so we looked at it, and we almost decided to just not use it. We're just not going to use survey data for our analysis because we can't make any sense of it. But luckily, the intern who conducted the survey was still working at Star Metro, and we were able to have an interview with her, and she came to campus and sort of made us a code book. And in this case, her code book was her on her laptop in a Word document answering all of our questions. So the importance of code books. And methodologies and workflows. I know a lot of labs have their own data management policies, even if you don't call it a data management policy, but things that graduate students and people who work in your lab are expected to follow. Those types of standard operating procedures are also helpful data to include in your data management plan. Does that make sense? Great. And so what's research data management? Unlike definitions of data, where none of them seem to agree and they're all very different, most of the data management definitions are the same. So like last time, I chose a definition that didn't focus on what data management is, but rather what it does. And so research data management is part of the research process. The reason these plans exist and the reason we'll talk about the NSF and the NIH requiring data management plans is because sometimes folks don't think about how to manage their data until the project's almost over. And at that point, it's so much more work to document your data after the project, if it's even possible, because sometimes it might not be. And storing observational data sets, things that can get lost. So it's something that's part of the research process, something to consider before the project starts, during the project, and something to consider after your research is complete. And also its efficiency. Good data management saves money and it saves time. That's why it's a requirement. And most importantly, and the reason that you all are probably here today, is to meet the expectations and requirements of the university and more particularly the funder requirements. And so why manage research data? Another fun academic definition that I like, which comes from Anna Gold, who was a librarian for the NSF, and she also worked for the Library of Congress. She actually helped build the NSF website, and she's very familiar with these with these policies and these procedures, she treats research data as the currency of science, right? So the currency of tenure are your publications. If you don't publish, then you don't make tenure. Yeah, and so, right? But what are the things that make publications? It's your research data, and if somebody takes your work and extends on it and builds on it and creates new discoveries, yes, your article is going to help them, and the summary statistics that you provide are going to be useful, but it's going to be the raw data that's going to feed into subsequent learning and subsequent sharing. I actually usually spend a lot more time preaching on why to manage research data, but I know you're all here to kind of figure out how to get through that. In 2013, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is headed by Dr. Holdren, issued a memorandum that essentially ensured that the results of federally funded research is made publicly. This includes publications as well as data sets. And so OSTP, from an organizational standpoint, they have all these agencies like the NSF, the NIH, the Department of Energy, Department of Transportation. All of those agencies report up to OSTP. So they wrote this memo in 2013 that said, you have to make sure that data is publicly available from the research that you fund. So what happens in any bureaucracy is it trickles down very slowly, and it all becomes very different by agency. But it does need to be different by agency because, the National Endowment of Arts is going to be totally different than NIH. But this memorandum was kind of the start. It was it let librarians such as myself know that at some point, every single one of these agencies is going to have a public access requirement around data as well as publications. Our scholarly communications librarian, Devin, he actually works with those types of things as well. So what happened is some organizations have actually been requiring publication or information and data sharing long before the requirements from OSTP. So NIH has had a data information sharing requirement since 2008. The NSF has had a 2-page data management requirement since 2011, which predates our memo. But what's more important are the speed at which these things move. I listed the Department of Energy to kind of illustrate a story. When I first started, I was teaching a class. How many of y'all know Sarah Hart from the psych department? I was working when Sarah's in her class, right, kind of talking about data management with her lab. And we got done with our lecture, and I'm just kind of checking some email, killing a little time before I leave. And I noticed an email that said the Department of Transportation issued their public access policy. And it was literally right when I got done lecturing. So I asked the students to stay, and I said, hey, you want to check this out? I turned my little thing back on, I showed them the email, and then we went and actually looked through the policy together just to kind of show them the speed at which the research moves. And that, yes, you may have known the data management requirements of places where you look for funding a couple years ago, but it changes so fast that you constantly have to go back and relook at the language. And I list the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation here because data management, it does save time, it does save money, and it does advance science and scholarship. And so private funding agencies are realizing that, and they're issuing the same sorts of requirements. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has data management plan requirements, and so does the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, also requires that you write a data management plan. So this is going to be the part where we're going to look at individual requirements from funding agencies. And the first one we're going to start with is the NSF, because how many of you either receive NSF funding or are trying to receive NSF funding? No one. Okay, well, we won't spend that much time on it then. So, right, the NSF, they have a data sharing policy. It's existed for a while. And since 2011, they require a 2-page data management plan, which is actually really hard. It's hard to get all that information in 2 pages. You can't use bullet points a lot of times. And it has to talk about accessibility, how you're going to share your research data. But as most of you might know, if you've looked at the NSF, they have tons of directorates, and every data management requirement varies within these. So the first one we look at is kind of the generic one. It was the first one that they made. And here are the 5 things they asked for. They want the data types. So like we did in the beginning where we listed observational data, experimental data, this is where you do that. You actually list everything that you plan to create, what the type is, and then the second part is standards for metadata and data documentation. So metadata is data about data. And a lot of folks have a hard time with that, with describing information in a way that people outside of your discipline can find that information. So using controlled vocabulary and subject terms that are interoperable. Things that librarians can help with. We've been cataloging things forever. And you also have to have policies for sharing, and so you have to discuss what type of copyright, what type of licensing you're going to put on your research data. So is it all rights reserved? Is it going to be a Creative Commons license? Other things that we can help you with in the libraries as well. And you have to have a plan for archiving, the fifth part here. So where does your data live after the project? And how is it going to be made publicly available? How are people going to access that? The NSF wants you to list that at the bottom of your data management plan, which sometimes requires finding a repository or something like that to put your data in. How many of you actually either use a data repository to find data or have deposited research in a repository? A few of you have? Okay, good. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those later. So here's the directorate for biology, right? And it's kind of the same. You can see the first two sections are exactly the same. But the third one, and this probably came from some sort of need, I guess, within this directorate, they want roles and responsibilities of who is going to manage the data. So I, Renane, the PI, will be in charge of implementing the data management plan that I wrote. Or what is the case in a lot of situations is a graduate assistant will actually be the one that ensures, that the code books are done and goes through the checklist to make sure everything's completed as per the data management plan that you submitted to the NSF. That's totally acceptable. A lot of people delegate that responsibility. Does anybody have any questions on the NSF? Because I do, this is another one just to show you how much they vary. So this is the social and behavioral sciences. And their data is a lot more straightforward. It's a lot more survey data. It's a lot smaller size-wise. And so their plans are a little simpler. One thing that you'll see is some of these requirements are so vague that they're a bit tricky. So additional possible data management requirements. It's not really helpful. They don't really tell you what that is. But what I would interpret that is if you needed to anonymize data or if there were certain parts of your data set that you couldn't share because of privacy issues, then you would just explain that in that section. Any NSF questions before we bounce off? I'm sorry, somebody.
When you're doing the plan and the person's responsible, would it be anybody that's listed as senior personnel? Does everybody, anybody listed as such, do they have to have a responsibility or are they part of the?
Well, you have to specifically write who is responsible. So it can be the PI, it could be a senior researcher, but when the emails go out for non-compliance, they want a particular person to contact, so not an institution or a lab. Okay. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sure.
For reporting purposes.
Sure. The question was whether or not it should be go ahead.
If you're listed as senior personnel.
If you're listed as senior personnel, do you have to list that person as the person responsible for data management? And that's not, you don't necessarily have to do that. You just have to
have the role that's
exactly, you just have to have the role specifically defined. Any other NSF questions? How about NIH? Did any of you apply for NIH funding? Okay, good. And so, they've had a public access policy since 2008. And anything that is more than $500,000 has to have a data sharing plan. So you either have to write a plan on how you plan to share your research data, or you have to write, I guess, why you can't share your research data. And with NIH funding, a lot of times you can't share it because it's medical. And at some point, if you anonymize data, it's useless. So sometimes you have to write that in there. The NIH actually has a good implementation guideline. It's very elaborate and explains what you need to do. All the links are in the slides too for this information. We'll distribute that stuff later. And so the NIH, sometimes these are the toughest ones because they just have, the NSF actually has all those sections you work on one at a time. And I think that's easier because it's discrete. But this is a little tougher because you just sort of got to mash it all into one paragraph. But if you dig through their implementation guideline, you can see that they look for the exact same things that everybody else is looking for. So they want a description of the data collected, formats and types, how you're going to distribute your research data, and a timeline. So the NSF also ask for timelines. One thing that we've noticed when we work with researchers is we've got comments back from the NSF about their data sharing timeline. And what the PI put in her plan, which seemed fine to me at the time, was that 6 months after the final publication will be when the data set is put into a repository. It seemed okay to me. The NSF actually wants maybe not a day, but a specific time after the project's over, not after the publication's over. So it kind of puts you on the hook to get your things out quickly, because essentially you could just keep saying you have another publication out and you can delay your data sharing. So again, it's an issue I'm sure they've probably had and that we just didn't see. We didn't think of it that way. But they actually provided comments on her data management plan about rather than how many months out after publication, how many months out after project closeout will your research data be made available. So it does put a lot more pressure on, and so it's something that really needs to be considered, because you need to pick a date that you can meet. And so NIH has other parts of the application where you might want to consider data management. One is budget. So sometimes if you're going to deposit your research data in a repository like ICPSR, they charge curation fees, because when you give it to them, they're going to make sure your code book's up to par. They're going to create a metadata file. They're going to make it accessible. They're going to convert your so if you give them a Stata file, they're going to turn that into Stata, SAS, SPSS, R, and ASCII files, have all that available for researchers. And a lot of times it costs money. And so if you're going to deposit your data in a repository that charges fees, or you have to purchase some sort of infrastructure, it would be in your best interest to include it in the budget. And the NIH actually encourages putting that information in your budget. And we can help you get quotes from repositories and things like that. And the background, if you're creating a large data set, you could add it to the significance portion. It's very rare, but most importantly, the human subject section is going to deal with data management, but you all kind of know that. How about, I think I already asked, nobody here applying for NOAA grants?
I just questions about
Sure.
comment on the NIH. So we recently submitted an R01, and I don't know if I only saw this now because of my role as an analyst, but we were required to not just have a plan, but we had to say who was going to do it, how much time and effort was going to be devoted to it, and it was and we couldn't be funded for that time and effort. So I don't know.
So you said that you had to describe how long you were, or how the process of making your data available, and you said that you were not going to be given funding for that?
So we had to talk about data management, but then we had to say who's going to do it, which makes sense, but also the number of hours per week.
So you have to identify who's going to do it and how many hours?
Right,
Okay.
and that was not included in our budget request.
Oh, wow.
So I don't know if that's new. I don't know if I'm the analyst on the project.
Right.
I don't know if the PI
So,
misinterpreted or.
I don't know the whole story, but my first guess would be that may have been something that didn't get caught. And I know some folks are actually hesitant to include that cost in their budget because they think it's going to affect their ability to get funding. But from what I found, the cost of managing your research data is usually a drop in the bucket compared to the entire grant itself.
It was very small, like 2 to 3% of time and effort.
That's good to know. And what department are you from?
Social work.
Okay, that's good to know.
Maybe we should have built. Maybe budgeted for it. Didn't know we could.
Next time.
We'll double up next time.
Sounds good. And so NOAA's is another one that's pretty new. If I remember correctly, it was early 2015 that they released their policy. And theirs is just like everyone else's, type of data created, schedule for sharing. But one thing that's different about NOAA, which is neat and I think unique to maybe meteorology and the study of climate, is they want you to list the previously published data that you're going to use in your data management plan. And so we actually worked with a couple folks from COAPS on a NOAA grant. And they're creating a forecasting a climate model, a climate change model, and so they had to mine tons of historic data, right? Because the way you build a model is you put a bunch of observations in there, you weight it, you spit stuff out, and it predicts the future. And so they want to know what secondary data sources are being utilized. So that's just kind of a unique wrinkle with NOAA. Are there any, last time I checked, there weren't any humanities folks that registered for the workshop. Has that changed? It hasn't, okay. So even the humanities are doing data management requirements. We'll kind of get through this a little quick since none of you are applying for this funding. But the Office of Digital Humanities actually requires a DMP with their applications as well. And their requirement is modeled after the NSF to enable you to take advantage of data management resources that have already been developed for applying to NSF, which is unfortunate because the majority of institutions and labs haven't developed that infrastructure to support the NSF. So it's sort of read to me as a bit of a cop-out. Kind of like, well, the NSF already released these plans, so we're going to release the same requirements, and you already have the infrastructure, so don't worry about it. That's not true, and so if you do find yourself applying for that type of funding, you can work with us at the libraries, and we'll identify infrastructure here or elsewhere that can help you facilitate that process. So they want to know what data is generated and what is your plan for managing the data. So it's essentially our 6 categories collapsed into one bullet point. And they said that it was modeled after the Social and Behavioral and Economic Sciences Directorate, which is actually pretty common because some folks, particularly in the libraries, we have assessment librarians and people that work with research data all the time, but we don't have data management requirements for yet because it's not funded research, it's just our own research. So we use I use the exact same behavioral and economic directorate for those data management requirements. The NEA also has requirements. I read how art works. I actually read the whole research agenda and it was pretty fascinating. But they also want you to put raw data and metadata from the project in there. And you'll see that one thing that I found very neat from NEA that kind of gave me a lot of joy was that projects that offer to make data available to the public will actually be given special consideration for the NEA, which is really nice because to my knowledge, that's the first I've seen of any of that. The NIH, we've helped people where their NIH data sharing was just saying how they're not going to share any of the research data because it's not possible, and they receive funding. And so it's kind of nice to see a group get behind it and actually give priority to people that make their information public. Any questions on the particular funder policies before we start looking at tools? So kind of the concept of data management. No? So we talked about repositories a little bit, and I asked you if any of you have ever deposited your research, and some of you have. How many of you have heard of ICPSR? Somebody has, that's right, we found ICPSR data together. It's a really tough acronym, it's written up there, but they're the largest social science repository, they say in the world, but I think probably just the US. But FSU is an institutional member, and so we get discounted rates for depositing our information there. But one of the roles repositories play is they preserve things to help you meet funder requirements, and they also support interoperability. So like I told you earlier, ICPSR will save your data set in as many different file formats as possible for stats packages, which enhances not only interoperability but reproducibility. And you can link to it. So you're measured, you're judged by the impact of your research, essentially. How many people read your articles, how many people download it. The same thing applies for research data. So if folks use your research data for their analysis, they have to cite it, otherwise that's plagiarism. And so what these repositories do is they create object identifiers, and they have metadata and suggested citations so that it's easy for people who use your data to cite your data. So it kind of reduces the chance of incidental or blatant plagiarism. And community engagement and access control. So some folks deposit their research data in ICPSR and it's restricted use data. It has confidential information. So when you deposit it, it goes away somewhere where the public cannot access it, but there's a metadata field of your research that describes your project. And if folks want to access it, they have to contact ICPSR and fill out a form saying that they won't do anything bad and that they track who makes those requests. So it's easier to track who's using your research data. So just because your information is is sensitive doesn't mean that it cannot be deposited. You can have restricted deposits in certain repositories. How many of you use GitHub for code? I'm starting to use GitHub for kind of everything, like document sharing and things like that, because it versions even better than Google Docs. And Dryad is a really large science repository. Does anybody use Dryad? So there's 4 types of repositories. The first is a research repository, which is essentially a fancy way of saying a project website. Sometimes your research is so unique and doesn't fit in other categories, so interdisciplinary, that there really isn't an appropriate place for your data, so you build a website and put it there. In many cases, that's okay. The other one, which is more important, or which are the ones I showed you here, the ICPSR, Dryad, GitHub, these are domain repositories, so they're subject-based. 9 times out of 10, we recommend that folks deposit their research data in a subject-based, a domain-based repository, because researchers that are doing the same thing as you are going to look. So anyone who comes to my office who, I'm also a social sciences librarian, so I liaise to the urban planning department, economics, and geography. Whenever their grad students come asking for research data, we go to ICPSR at some point, because I have a degree in social sciences. I learned about ICPSR when I was in school, and it's reputable. So I point all my researchers to the same place. So if you want people to find your stuff, that's usually the best way. The idea of a national repository, at least in the United States, is a concept. It's not actual a thing. So have you been to data.gov? A few? Okay. It's actually quite useful. It links out to, you can find data on specific categories, but data.gov isn't actually housing the information. It's just linking you out to DOT, NOAA, places like that. And the last is the institutional repository. How many of you all know that we have an institutional repository? Good. So we have a place where you can put your articles. We have a place where you can put your data, depending on file size. I see Devin over there like, I don't know. But the NSF actually recommends that you utilize institutional repositories, mostly because they exist. Most schools, they kind of have them now. And if they don't, they have plans to have them shortly. And so many researchers have data that's so interdisciplinary that they don't have a domain repository. So I worked with the researcher. I don't want to give away what she's working on, but essentially her project had survey data, and it also had long form interview data, but it also had satellite imagery of the area, because this person studies vegetation and forestry and things like that. And so we couldn't find a place that was good for survey data, but was also good for satellite imagery. We couldn't find a place where those two met, and it seemed really weird to put half the data in ICPSR and put the other half in another repository. So in this case, it would probably make the most sense to just put her data sets in our institutional repository and link it out from there. Because since it's not going to fit into a subject repository, at least they'll know that that person's from FSU, and our information indexes with Google Scholar, so you'll be able to find data sets and publications in our repository by doing a Google Scholar search. It makes things more discoverable. Do you guys have any questions about repositories? Because the needs of your repository, where you're going to archive your data, it doesn't transfer across departments. And so it's different from everybody. And so I don't really spend a whole lot of time talking about it, because we're not going to really have to deal with that until we get there. This is the fun part. So DMP Tool is it was developed out of the California Digital Library and is part of the UC system. And this was created by researchers in an attempt to get in front of the federal funding requirements. So what DMP Tool does is it provides you with templates where you can go in and just pick your funding agency and fill out the data management plan. So these slides here are for folks that aren't with us, so they can go in and create a plan. But what we're going to do is do a live demonstration, because that's more fun. So this is dmptool.org, and FSU is a partner institution to DMP Tool. And what that means is when you click on login, you go down to FSU, and it redirects you to Blackboard. So you don't have to remember another password. And you do have to give permission for FSU to release your name and email address. I do want to address that directly. that's a requirement from Campus ITS that that box has to be there for any third party. So DMP Tool is not going to do anything with your data or information, but you can't register for an account if you don't put an email address in. So essentially you are giving them your data. So I did feel the need to explain that because that kind of freaks people out when they go log on and see that warning. And when you log in, you can do several things. You can create a new data management plan. So is anybody working on an application? We can go into a specific funder if you want. Otherwise, I'm just going to pick one. Okay, a particular directorate or? Okay, let's see what we have. So we're going to go into the NSF and we're going to look and see what they have. The NSF has a lot. There we go. Here's materials researcher. So we were asked to find a template for NSF materials directorate. Make sure I click it properly. And we click next. We title our DMP. I have to be creative because I have too many test ones. And you can select private, public, institutional. The majority of you are going to want to leave it private, especially while you're working on it. And the fun part is you can invite folks to your data management plan. So you can invite other colleagues, but for many of you, you do collaborative research work with folks at other institutions. So what really helps is you don't have to be a partner institute to have a DMP Tool account, You can just use the regular login. So if you're working with folks from other universities, once they sign up, you can add them to your data management plan so that you can co-draft it, kind of like a Google Doc. And so let's see if Devin created one yet. No. Let's see. How many of you all know Micah? Yeah, people know Micah. He created an account, so we're going to add him to a random data management plan so he gets an email. Maybe.
So just for your KPIs.
That's right. And I don't know if it's loading or if I'm doing something wrong, so let's see. There it is, it's loading. And so this is what it looks like once you get started. You noticed earlier how I had things listed in bullet points of sections you had to fill out. DMP Tool does that for you. It kind of marks everything out. So with our first part, we have types of data being produced. Here, I think you can actually drag this. Oops, sorry about that. There we are. You can change the box size up here to read more text. So you can read the language that actually comes from the NSF and provide you with links. So you can actually read the guidance directly if you don't want to read the Cliff Notes version. And we put our own links here too. So when you get stuck and you need to contact the data librarian, you have a link in there, so you can do that. And Micah and I and Devin, we go in and we customize these things with links and resources. And Beth and folks provide us with information. I think we have a link to your office here. Yeah, see? And so you can do that for each part. If you're not really sure, what is metadata? What do they mean by that? You can read and you can kind of work on it. So let's just kind of briefly put something in here. There we go. And I would suggest putting a little more thought into your own data management plan. Lots of metadata. And now I'll just get lazy and kind of work through it. The plans for archiving and preservation is going to be the part that takes the most time because you actually have to go out and identify repositories that are going to be suitable for your research and find out whether it's going to cost money. A lot of them don't cost money. A lot of them, there are free options out there. And this is also the section where I would advise that if you feel any level of discomfort or feel lost in any way, to just reach out and send me an email or give me a phone call, because what we can do is we will do the research for you. We'll identify a list of repositories and we'll rank them based on what we think the best place you should deposit your data, or maybe the freest place where you can deposit your data depending on your budget, we'll do a lot of that research for you, because we are in a lot of these, we do the same directorates over and over again. So we recommend the same repositories because we know, what they're asking for. So this is the last section. Right. And this is our DMP. And we can export it as a PDF or a doc. Chances are you're pasting this into a proposal, so I'd recommend using the Word doc. And there you have it. We do have a nice computer. This stuff's kind of new.
A lot faster.
Are all of the federal funding agencies in DMP Tool?
Good question. Most of them are. Some of them, I should repeat the question. Are all of the federal funding policies in DMP Tool? And the answer to that is no, not always. So for example, the Department of Transportation issued a public access policy in November, just a couple months ago. First thing I did was, we have a large engineering school, so I assumed that we're going to have people applying for those grants. So we did a little research, I read the policy, and I went to DMP Tool to see if we had a template, and we didn't, so I made one. And as a partner institution, we can contribute templates to DMP Tool, and their review process is very thorough. So they have data librarians who've been around a lot longer than me that sort of review it. It has like its own peer review process where we have librarians that look through it to make sure it's good. And then we actually DMP Tool contacts the funder agency and provides them the template to review. They give the seal of approval, the thumbs up, and the template goes live. So I'm glad you asked that question, because when you go in and you don't find your your funding agency, even if it's private, contact us. We will make you a template for your research. We will, and we've done that before. So I made a DOT template, and right now, ironically, nobody from the DOT's reviewed it yet, so that's the bottleneck. But that'll be made public. That'll be made public soon. But we did create one for the NSF Career Grant because lots of folks applied for that last year. And so Micah and I had helped so many people that we decided we would just put our own in DMP Tool. And so we go here to NSF Career. We won't add anybody this time. All right, and so we just went in and we read their policy ourselves, and we just created our own local template. So this template's only available for you all. It's not available for everyone else, just because we needed to make it quickly.
So the NSF changed their PAPG, their GPG, their policy guide became effective this month, I think the 25th of this month. So will you go and check to make sure that it's still, for when people are applying for this year, that it will be in line with any changes in the policy guide?
So a lot of this information changes from year to year. And what Beth asked is if we go in there and actually do quality control checks to make sure the latest information's in there. And yes, we do. So for the NSF Career, it's going to be on Micah and I to go in and actually redo the information and to make sure it's up to date. I want to make a note of that. And the good news is with the large public templates, they have a system built in where people are constantly reviewing it. So the templates that are publicly available are always going to be up to date with the best information because they have a full-time team over there that does things. Let's see. Another thing that's nice about DMP Tool is if you write a grant and you're successful and it's a good data management plan, you could, if you wanted to, and I would like to encourage certain folks to do so, is to share that data management plan with folks in your department or your institution so that we can all learn and get better. I work with Stephanie Sims, who is the communication and marketing person with DMP Tool, and that's one of their biggest initiatives, is to try to get people to share more information, and because there aren't a lot of good examples of what is a knockout data management plan, what is exactly what the funders are looking for. Some actually do have examples on their website, but not all of them do, and it's kind of inconsistent. Any questions about DMP Tool? No. Another thing about this is sometimes people don't like DMP Tool. It's okay. I do understand it's kind of hard to use. It's kind of clunky and doesn't look really pretty. The community is very responsive to changing things. So if you see something you don't like, just email me and I'll make sure that they get that feedback, because they want to make this tool better for everybody. And from what I hear, it's being recommended more by funder agencies to actually use DMP Tool to create data management plans, which is nice, because what I like about it is it may not be the prettiest interface, but it does have a lot of good information. It has the information you need to get your plan made. So, any other questions about DMP Tool or data management? Because I'm going to move on to the part where we talk about our services and the things we do in the libraries.
What other agencies are loaded in here?
Yep, we're asking if, I was asked if other agencies are loaded in here. Let's just sort of briefly scroll through some of them so we can actually see how many are in here.
Is there a way for you to enlarge that?
Yes, I hope so. Is that better?
Yeah.
Great. Is that too big? That's good. Right, and so we have, I knew that. And so they have a lot of them, but data management requirements are gonna be public access requirements are gonna be drafted faster than these templates are made. And so I do my best to try to stay ahead of the landscape and to find things. With DOT, I found it first, but sometimes that won't be the case. So when you see these new things, just to kind of reiterate, to contact me, and we will make a template for you. Or at the very least, just work with you on your one grant and then go back and make the template later. So we have a lot of the ones I talked about, NOAA.
Expand National Institute.
Sure, absolutely. So they have the regular one, and then they have a special one. Yeah, it really is. And when you look at that, I'll have to clear these out. You see how short this is or how small it is? But it does have the same information that I had in my slides. So it does walk you through what you need to do. But there's not much to it. It's just your data sharing plan.
Does Health and Human Services have a separate template?
I don't know.
For some of the other agencies that don't fall under NIH, HRSA, CDC, CMS.
I believe CDC does have a data management plan. But a lot of it, we just kind of have to do research on a case-by-case basis to see what the requirements are. And sometimes all you can find is that there's a data management requirement, but you can't find the specifics of what exactly is it asking for. But there were I saw some hands up earlier. Yes, sir. Oh.
Can you expand the Department of Energy?
The part of what?
Department of DOE. Can you expand the Department of Energy?
Sure, here you go.
Always cool.
Did you want me to open a particular one?
No, because they have also kind of career, right? Is that a generic?
The DOE has career grants?
Yeah.
Like an early investigator.
Investigator.
That would be a situation where I would have to research and see if they had specific requirements for that grant. I don't know off the top of my head whether they have a separate one. My first guess would be that the generic one would usually suffice for something like that, but we'd have to look into that.
So actually, this is good because my question sort of has to do with Department of Energy. So when we did a study with them, they have their own repository, and so we were mandated to put our data there. So so what kind of flexibility do we have, particularly with federal funders, as to where we put our data, or are most of them sort of dictating?
The question is, what type of flexibility do researchers have as to where to deposit their data? My answer to that would be it depends on the funder agency. So with the DOE, if they're putting in significant investments to build their own infrastructure, they're probably going to require that you deposit in there. NOAA tells you exactly what repositories to deposit your research data in. If you want to put things in your institutional repository, that's fine, but they're trying to build their own infrastructure. So for organizations like that, it's less flexibility in the sense that they're telling you places you have to put it, but flexible in the sense that if you want to put it somewhere else in addition to that, you can. Does that answer your question? Right. Any other questions about specific funder agencies? Let's actually look at DOE, just because I've never looked at it, other than just kind of read, not in DMP Tool. Okay. So you'll notice here, they have a part on protection, on data security. Rationale for the data management plan. And so they specifically list software and codes as a separate category of data. My guess is that most people don't think to include scripts and software as part of their data management plan, so they just listed it separately so that folks would do that. Right, so that's DMP Tool. And like I said, I've been here since April 2014. And so we've been sort of just building services incrementally based on what we think that you all need. So we spend a lot of time doing data management types of services because that's what folks have asked us to provide help with. And so we can help you with DMP consultations. If you want to touch base with us before you even write the plan, we can do that. And the way that this process normally works is as sort of, I guess, the spearheader of data management things in the library, I'll put together a small team. So if it's a project in physics or if it's a project in biology, I'll go find our subject librarian, because we have subject librarians in every department that are there to serve all your research needs, actually. I can help you find them too. And we'll put a project team of a subject librarian, myself, and then usually somebody kind of like a project coordinator to do like a lot of the typing and stuff. And we'll go to your office and we'll look through your proposal with you, and we will help sketch out every section of the data management plan. And then we can do it in Google Docs, DMP Tool, and go back and forth and work with you until you're satisfied with it. But a lot of folks, they just get started without us. They want to, they start working on their own, and they get stuck when they don't know where to put their research data. So if you only have questions of specific parts of the plan, and you just want us to do repository research, we can do things like that. Like I said, we'll put a little project team together. We'll look for repositories, metadata standards. So different, the NOAA has their own metadata format that you're supposed to use. They have their own templates. Different agencies, they don't have requirements. They just tell you to pick one and use it. And so as librarians, finding or implementing metadata schemes is something we've done historically for a really long time. So we're very comfortable kind of finding existing schemes out there like Dublin Core that can just sort of meet the needs that you need for your project. So we can help tackle those things like data description. So if you wanted us to, if you had a lab, if you had a crew of researchers working on something and you wanted to standardize data documentation, we could go talk to them about best practices and how to do that and how to create metadata as you're creating data sets, which is the best way to do it because you don't have to go back and do a lot of work later. And we also do classroom and lab instruction. So as we produce more PhDs and they go out in the world, this is going to be the only world they know, the world of public access and data sharing and data management. So if you're either supervising a lab or you're doing a research methods class or any other class that you think that this type of information is appropriate, we can come give those talks. And what we do is it's based on whatever the discipline is. So I'll find more examples that are based on your area, and we'll talk about the concept. Why do you manage data? And what are the nuts and bolts? Like, what are the little things in data management you have to do? Like standardize variable naming, standardize file naming, so that you don't have 4 different GAs naming files 4 different ways. We can go in and sort of provide a lot of those best practices in the classroom setting if that's something that you all would like. just as a bit of promotion, this is our team. There's Devin. Oh, Devin left. But that's us.
Something you said.
I know, I offended. He didn't have a DMP. He's going to create a DMP Tool account. So that's what it is.
I have a question.
Yes.
Time frame for these services. Let's say, I know, I work for Sponsored Research Administration, and there are a lot of NIH deadlines in February, for instance. Should a PI decide they want to use your services for something like 212? What, is that a feasible time frame?
The question is, what is the time frame for these services, and how much notice do you have to give ahead of time? The short answer is we will always help you. We will always try. But the difference is if you let us know 2 days in advance, you get the 2-day version. Where if you let us know 2 weeks in advance, you get the 2-week version. It's a little better. And I do try to spell that out, because we've had these discussions on, well, what is the level of service that we need to establish to hold ourselves accountable and make sure that we're getting things done in a fast way, but also making sure we're putting out a quality product. So sometimes the best we can do, I, believe it or not, have been contacted 48 hours before a deadline for help. And it's usually just a list of recommendations, because I can't really write a data management plan in that period of time. But I would encourage everyone to contact me sooner than later, contact us sooner than later, because the more time, the more research we can do into creating the plan. And it gives you time to send things back to us. So if we write a list of recommendations that'll take you a few hours to write and implement, when more questions come up, we can just go back and forth right up until the deadline. But that's a good question. Thank you for asking, because more time is better. But we will, if you're under the gun and are finding yourself right in front of a deadline, go ahead and send me that email anyway, and we'll do what we need to do on a case-by-case basis. Does that answer your question? Great. Are there any other questions? Comments? Well, it looks like we're going to get out a little early, but thank you for braving the weather and for coming out here. I really appreciate it. And
So just a couple of quick things. Thank you so much to Renee for putting on this awesome workshop. If there are any questions for folks who are in this room or folks who are watching at home, please contact Renee directly to work on those awesome data management plans. The sooner the better. The slides will be online, as well as the video, in the next couple of days. So tell your colleagues who perhaps weren't able to come. There are feedback sheets over there, so we're always trying to improve the workshops we're putting on and training. So if you leave us our feedback, you can leave them there on the table or send them back to us. And because of this training, we are going to start putting successful DMPs on our website.